So then what we can do is we can come back and we can look at the grammar again and we can say, okay, what's next? And so I'm going to take this, copy this, and paste it in here and take a look. And so what I'm going to do as I go through here is things that we've seen already, I will indent. Okay, and then there's the new stuff. So it'll get pretty lengthy, but don't worry. So again, we've got an ordinary compilation unit. I've chosen to have an ordinary compilation unit. So I guess technically that really ought to be indented because we've already seen that. And now what I'm saying is, instead of choosing nothing for that ordinary compilation unit, I'm going to choose the rule for a top-level class or interface declaration. And coming back over here, we're down here I'll click on this, and it's actually going to take me into the earlier chapters, chapter 7, where this is talked about in more detail. So you can click on any one of those, and we can go into more detail about what it is. But we see that the definition of a top-level class or interface declaration is either a class declaration thing, or an interface declaration thing, or a semicolon. And it may be a little hard to see, but that semicolon is in a fixed width font. Okay, it's a terminal symbol, so I can actually type a semicolon. And so that's what I've done, is I've chosen a semicolon here, and again, made a note that over here on the side, that could be a class declaration instead, or an interface declaration, and we'll come back later and look at those. Okay. Furthermore, what I've done is, if I indent after I get to all terminal symbols, so again, I'm always going to start with a compilation unit, have to. That's my goal symbol. And I should always end with only terminal symbols. When I only end with terminal symbols, I might have some variations on that, and I'll indent those. So in other words, remember, a top-level class or interface declaration, there can be 0 or more of them. Okay? And if we choose to have one of them, I'm choosing a semicolon for that. Okay? But if I had 2 or 3 of these, then each one of those could be a semicolon, so multiple semicolons should be legal as well. The semicolon is a statement terminator in Java, and so basically what we're saying is these are just empty statements. They're really saying nothing, but again, it's like the period at the end of a sentence, so it would be like having a bunch of a novel. Make a novel that's just a bunch of periods. Anyhow, so I am going to come over here to my Java file now and type a semicolon in there. I will save that, and then I'll bring up my command prompt and invoke the Java compiler on that. Silence. So the compiler was successful. The compiler was happy with the syntax in there. And if I do a list, we see there was still no output. Okay. Again, it was an empty statement, so it doesn't do anything, so we don't have any output yet. But what I can do is I can type a couple semicolons. I can even have some white space in here and more semicolons. I can save that, come over here, compile, and the compiler is still happy. Okay. So now, well, what's the next slightly more complicated thing we could have? In other words, we can look at, instead of having a empty class or top-level top-level class or interface declaration, we could have had a class declaration or an interface declaration there. So if we come over to my next iteration here, I am suggesting that we do this. My face is in the way, of course, but I'll copy that, bring that over here, paste that over here, and get rid of the stuff that is actually not Java. Actually all of this is, but we can take a look at this while we're here. I guess I probably really meant to paste that over here. So Control A, Control V, there we go. Okay. So Again, this is what we've already seen. The first indented lines, we know what we've seen a compilation unit, its definition, especially its definition as an ordinary compilation unit, and the definition of an ordinary compilation unit as a top-level class or interface declaration, one or more of those. And so now we're saying, okay, instead of looking at just the semicolon definition, what if it was a class declaration instead? And so we find that a class declaration is defined as one of three things. It's either a normal class declaration, an enum declaration, or a record declaration. You can see from what I've done over here is that I am choosing a normal class declaration, but again, I'm keeping track of the fact that that could have been an enum declaration or a record declaration, so that once I learn more about normal class declarations, I'll come back and switch to one of these, and then we can go down that rabbit hole. Okay, so the question becomes then, what is a normal class declaration? And what we notice here is the first token, optional 0 or more of those, but we see the keyword class, or at least we see CLASS in a fixed width font, so those are terminal symbols. We would actually type those. And it is a keyword in the Java language. It's part of the Java vocabulary. So prior to that, we can have class modifiers, but I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to opt not to have a class modifier. I'll stick it over here and say, okay, this could also have a class modifier, but I'm not going to have one. So I'm going to start with the keyword class. And then we see that class is followed by type identifier, a non-terminal called type identifier, but it's also not in any kind of brackets or braces, so therefore it is not optional. Okay. So I have to have a type identifier, and then I may or may not have some type parameters, so I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to have those. I'll keep track of those over here. I might have a class extends thing, but I'm not going to have that. I might have a class implements thing. No. I might have a class permits thing. I'll save that for later. Class body is required. Okay, so I have to have the keyword class followed by an identifier followed by a class body. Now I need to figure out, okay, what can I substitute in for an identifier and what can I substitute in for a class body? And of course, what do those things mean? That's the semantics of this. So let's just go with the syntax first and say that, okay, what is an identifier? What's the rule for an identifier? And we see that an identifier, type identifier. I'm up here yet. Type identifier is an identifier as long as it's not one of these terminal symbols: permits, record, sealed, var, or yield. Okay, great. But what's an identifier? And notice when I'm doing this, I'm going to go down in one symbol at a time, left to right, because the order matters. So left to right, I'm going to go down until I reach a terminal symbol. So you'll see that I'm just going to carry the class body through here for a while until I get to a valid identifier. So if we look at an identifier, we see that that is defined as an identifier chars as long as it's not a keyword, a Boolean literal, or a null literal. Okay? What's an identifier chars then? So I've got an identifier chars here now. And an identifier chars is defined as a Java letter, optionally followed by 0 or more Java letter or digits. Okay? So I'm going to say, hey, the simplest thing would be maybe a Java letter. And what's a Java letter? And a Java letter is any Unicode character that's a Java letter. Oh, that's very helpful, isn't it? Suffice to say that it's a Java. We can look up in Unicode and see what Java letters are actually defined as, but we'll take my word for it now, I guess, that it's any of our ASCII characters. Letter characters, A through Z, I should say. Uppercase and lowercase. And then that can be followed by, so we have to start with a letter, and that can be followed by 0 or more letters or digits. Okay, so we can include the digit symbols in our identifier names. Okay, they just can't start with a number. And if we think about it semantically, that's how the compiler is going to know are you trying to tell me about a number, or are you trying to tell me about a name of something? Okay. If it started with a digit symbol, then it would try to interpret it as a number. Okay. So all of our identifiers, in other words, the names that we make up to identify things, the names that we make up to refer to things, will always start with a letter, but they can include digits. So Java letter, I'm replacing it with a terminal symbol A. Uppercase A, that's what I chose. You could choose any letter you want. And that's followed by a class body, but now I need to go back and say, okay, well, what's a class body? So we go back here and we say, okay, a class body is defined as a set of curly braces with 0 or more class body declarations in there. So again, another one of those subtle points. Those outer curly braces are not italicized. They are in a fixed width font, so they are terminal symbols. We actually type those. That's one of the reasons why I tried in my notation to avoid using curly braces as part of my notation, because they actually are a part of the language. Okay, so we see that a class body declaration is defined as a set of curly braces. So now I've got terminal symbols here with 0 or more class body declarations in there. And so now I want to find out, okay, what's a class body declaration? What's the simplest thing I can substitute in there? So a class body declaration is defined as one of these 4 things: a class member declaration, an instance initializer, a static initializer, and a constructor declaration. Again, as we're doing this, the important thing is, what's a class? What's a member? What's an instance? What's an initializer? What's static mean? What's a constructor kind of thing? We're at least getting all these words now that we can say, hey, what do they mean? And we can work with them and figure them out. Okay, I'm going to choose class member declaration. Okay, and say that, okay, yes, it could have been an instance declaration, instance initializer, or a static initializer, blah blah blah. Okay, but now I can ask myself, okay, what is the definition of a class member declaration? What is the definition of a class member declaration? And a class member declaration is defined as one of these 5 things. Actually, 6 things, I guess. 6 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 things. A field declaration, or a method declaration, or a class declaration, or an interface declaration, or a semicolon again. In other words, we can have an empty statement here. Okay, so that's what I'm going to go with. That's the simplest thing I can think of. And what that means then is that saying class A, curly braces, semicolon, should be a valid program. So I'm going to copy this and bring this over to my file here. Get rid of all that garbage that I put in there earlier and say, okay, this I'm thinking should be good. The compiler should be happy about this. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to attempt to compile it. Lo and behold, the compiler is happy with that. If I do a listing, now I have a new file. I have a file that ends in .class, and the name of it is uppercase A. What do you think the odds are that that's randomly in uppercase A and this is randomly in uppercase A? No, it's not. It's a feature of Java that file names and class names should match. It's part of the reason, we'll talk more about this down the road and show some examples, but it's how the compiler can find things without having to have elaborate makefiles and build systems and so forth. Because if it ever needs to find something that it doesn't know, it can go out and look for a file with the name of that thing and hopefully find it. Okay, bear with me on that one. But what that means now is that since we have a class file, that's an executable file, so we can invoke the Java runtime on this. We can invoke the Java virtual machine and say, hey, process that. So if I just say, hey, Java, we see that much like the compiler Java C, it comes back and says, hey, I run stuff. Give me stuff to run. So I'm going to say Java A, and I don't include the .class typically. So that I'm getting an error message But it's not because of that. In fact, it's telling me the main method was not found in class A. Well, the good news is it did recognize, apparently, that there is a class named A. But apparently it was expecting a main method in there, and it says, please define it as this. And we've seen this before kind of thing. Now what we want to do is find out, well, wait a minute. How would we have known that grammatically? What are the grammatical rules that say that this is okay? And in the process of doing that, we can figure out what these various tokens mean in here. Okay. There's a good start.